All right, last chapter, chapter 8, The Fight Quarreler's Cure. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She also saw that her twin sister Anne was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly. There's a big black spider in the bed, and it's on your side." Anne woke with a squeal, leapt out of bed, stubbed her toe on the box of paints she had left on the floor the night before, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Mother, Daddy!" Mrs. Russell sighed, sat up, and reached for her robe. She said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arms and jumped up, squealing. "But Mother, Joan said so. She said it's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, Oh, stop jumping and squealing and listen. If there is a big black spider in the bed, and it is highly unlikely, then why is Joan lying in there, staring at the ceiling and waiting to be bitten? And to be spanked, he added in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father. But when he finished speaking, she just said, "But Joan said there was a spider, Daddy. She said there was." And her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon." And he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang gaily in his shower, but Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed. For from the children's room she could hear, "That's my sock, give it to me." "'Tis not, it's mine, give it back." "Mother, Anne's slapping me." "That's my petticoat. You're putting on my petticoat. Give it to me." "'Tis not, it's mine." "That's mine. No, it's mine. 'Tis not, 'tis too." Slap, bang, crash, running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, quarreling from the minute they get up until they go to bed at night. "I do not believe I can stand another day of it." And she ran downstairs and began jamming the oranges into the juicer. Mr. Russell came whistling into breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again? I was hoping for sausage and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, we had sausages and buckwheat cakes yesterday morning." And Mr. Russell said, "Well, what about brook trout? Bill Smith has them nearly every morning." And Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Perhaps that is why he looks like a trout and his wife looks like a great big halibut." Mr. Russell peered at her over the top of his morning paper and said, "You know, sweetheart, I think that the children fighting and quarreling is making you a bit irritable." Mr. Russell said, "I think it is too. In fact, it is driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall they could hear, "It's my turn to go down first, Joan." "'Tis not, it's my turn. You were first yesterday. You know you were. But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crayon." "I did not." "You did too. Cheater, double cheater." And in came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then at Anne's, and she said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and all the most of everything." And Anne said, "You had the biggest yesterday. You're just a pig and you always want the most." And their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now hush." And he glared at them. The twins sat meekly down to their breakfast, and they had taken but 2 bites, however, when Anne poked Joan and hissed, I've got the most cereal. Ha, ha, ha." And Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon, and you only have 2. Ha, ha, ha." Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces, and she grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist in the ensuing scuffle and managed to tip over Anne's milk, and it spilled all over the front of their nice blue pleated skirts. Their daddy spanked them, and their mother sponged them off and they left for school, red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. And as they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. 'Tis not, 'tis too." After Mr. Russell had left for the office, Mrs. Russell picked up the phone and called her friend Mrs. Quickrick. She said, "Mrs. Quickrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother, and I want to know if Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel." "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Quickrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yesterday Myrtle hit Jasper with a big doll, and the eyes came out, and then Jasper hit Myrtle with the little hammer out of his nice new toolbox, and the head came off the hammer, and I just told them that they wouldn't have them breaking up their toys that way." Mrs. Russell said, "But the children, weren't they hurt?" And Mrs. Quickrick said, "Why, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely toys, and the doll hospital won't be able to put Myrtle's doll's eyes back in for 2 weeks. And you know how hard it is to get hammers these days." And Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you anyway, Mrs. Quickrick," and hung up. And she poured herself another cup of coffee. And while she drank it, she thought about it and her little fighter quarrelers. And then she had an idea. And she would call Mrs. Pigglewiggle and ask her what to do. Mrs. Pigglewiggle would know if anyone would. She called Mrs. Pigglewiggle and said, "Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I am Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." And Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Oh, yes, the twins. Such darling little girls and so pretty." And Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion. It is dreadful, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. You should hear them." And Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too. You have the most. You are a pig." Mrs. Russell said, "Why, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were at your house." And Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "No, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I have heard hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarreleritis is a common children's disease, and it is very contagious, but very easy to cure." "Easy to cure? Oh, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, how?" asked Mrs. Russell. "Well," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning a child wakens and feels cross, so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You've got on my shirt.' And the little brother says, 'I have not,' because he hasn't. And the cross child says, 'You have too,' and the quarreling has begun." The next morning, both children had the fighter quarreleritis, and they wake and begin shouting rudely at each other, and soon it's a habit, and they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that even if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them and see themselves as others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they were and would be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. First, however, you must write down every single fighting thing that the children say. Begin with this morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels. I do not believe that it will be necessary to slap and pinch, and to be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that it's just a game. Look quarrelsome, as well as acting quarrelsome, and one day usually is sufficient. Mrs. Russell said, "Every morning Joan tells Anne that there's a big black spider in her bed on Anne's side, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that?" My, said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. That is the way Bill and Tommy Peters used to start the day, only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra. Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. Goodbye and good luck. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Pigglewiggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word Anne and Joan's morning quarreling that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of them a bigger apple than the other, and then followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in their room while they undressed for bed and took notes. Fortunately, the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was softest, the amount of room they had in the bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, who had the biggest feet, whose mouth opened the widest, who had the most teeth, and everything. My, they were naughty and disagreeable. And when she had finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Pigglewiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. The next morning, Joan opened her blue eyes and was just reaching out to pinch Anne when she heard a commotion in her mother and daddy's room, and suddenly the door flew open, and in came Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing, "Anne, Joan, quick, there's a big black spider in our bed, and it's on my side." And Joan said calmly, "How do you know there's one? Did you see it?" Anne woke, and out of habit, she leapt out of bed and ran to the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder, and Anne, surprised, asked her what the trouble was. and her mother began pounding on the bed, yelling, "There's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Daddy said so. He saw it." And Anne said, "But Mother, if there is a spider, why is Daddy in there?" Her mother said, no, her mother paid no attention, but to her continued to squeal, "Daddy said there was. I'm so scared. Ew!" And Joan said, "We better go and look, Anne." And so they solemnly marched into their mother and Daddy's room, and Mr. Russell was lying in bed, gazing at the ceiling. Anne threw back the covers, and Joan peered into the bed. About all they could see were Daddy's feet and toes wiggling. And there's a picture of that. Mr. Russell said, Anne said sternly, "Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy?" And Mr. Russell said, "Was she scared?" and jumped out of bed and ran to the bathroom, shouting at the top of his voice, "Ha ha, my turn for the shower." At that, Mrs. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, "It is not your first turn, it's mine. You traded me your first turn yesterday for a new golf ball." And Mr. Russell laughed rudely and called out, "Too bad for you, I've got the door locked." And Mrs. Russell kicked at the door and shouted, "Cheater, cheater, cheater." Anne and Joan looked at each other. Their eyes were round with amazement, and Anne whispered, "Let's get dressed." And Joan said, "Yes, let's hurry." And they tiptoed out of the room, closing the door carefully behind them. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father quarreling. When Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Mrs. Russell said, "You use my towel, that's my towel." And Mr. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." And Mrs. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." And Mr. Russell said, "That's my shirt. You've got on my new shirt." And Mrs. Russell said, "Well, you wore my golf sweater." And Mrs. Russell said, "Take my new shirt. Take off my new shirt." And Mrs. Russell began to cry and sob. "You wore my golf sweater and you promised me that I could wear the shirt. You're a pig." And Mr. Russell said, "All right, baby, wear the old shirt." And at breakfast, Mr. Russell took a little ruler out of his pocket and measured the grapefruit. And then he took the biggest, and Mother snatched it away from him and spilled coffee on his new shirt. And Mother served scrambled eggs and gave herself a larger heaping plate, and Daddy a small serving. And Daddy looked at both plates and said, "Pig." "Speaking of pig," said Mrs. Russell, "it's my turn for the car." "'Tis not," said Mr. Russell. "It's my turn. You had the car all week." Mrs. Russell said, "I only drove it to the drugstore and back last week. You were the went clear to the golf club." And Mr. Russell said in a very disagreeable way, "It makes no difference to me how far you drove. You had your turn, madam." And Mrs. Russell began to cry. "I think you're mean," she cried. "Isn't it my turn, girls?" She looked at the twins, and the girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused and put on their coats and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops up to the bathroom and weighed them on the scales, and then took the two biggest. And Mother took the biggest baked potato, but she sorted the string beans out one by one so that everyone got an equal share, but they were ice cold. The twins cleared the table, and Anne carried the pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie was the twins' very favorite dessert, and so Anne was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy. But it was a waste of effort, for Mother reached over and grabbed the pie, saying, "I'll serve that." "Oh, no, you won't," said Daddy, jerking the pie back. "Will too," said Mother, reaching for the pie. But Daddy jerked it off the table and held it over his head. And Mother grabbed his wrist, and the pie went splat all over the rug. The twins began to cry, and they said, "Mommy and Daddy, please stop quarreling. We just can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful." And Mother said, "Why, we thought you enjoyed fighting." And Joan said, "We hate quarreling. We are so unhappy." And Anne said, "Fighting is terrible. This makes us miserable." And Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap, and Mr. Russell took Anne on his lap, and they said, "To tell you the truth, girls, we don't like quarreling either. It's just a habit we caught from you." "Why, we must have been quarreling all day." And the twins said, you have. And Daddy said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and solemnly pledge that there shall be no more quarreling in this house. And then we'll all walk up to Fiddley's drugstore and seal the pledge with ice cream. Does everyone agree?" "We all agree," they shouted. And so they joined hands and said, "I do solemnly pledge that I will not quarrel or fight in this house ever again." And then they walked up to Mr. Fiddley's drugstore and had ice cream sodas. And even though Anne saw Mr. Fidley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers, and even though Joan saw Mr. Fidley put 2 scoops of strawberry in Anne's soda and only 1 scoop in hers, neither of them said a word. The fight, quarrel, or itis is cured. The end. That is the end of the book of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle.